All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and as part of my never-ending quest to make life easier for my AWD 1000 web development technology and AWD 1111 database-driven web development students, I've been going through creating a series of video presentations based off of the ebooks of Mr. Flavio Copes. And I'm going over 7 different ebooks. And so far I've done his HTML ebook and his CSS ebook. And I'm about 70% of the way through his JavaScript ebook. And we're up to asynchronous programming and callbacks. Now, as it says here, most of the time JavaScript code is run synchronously. That means, as it says, you execute line 1, you get done, you execute line 2, you get done, you execute line 3, etc. And that's how it works in most programming languages. But that's not always the way that it should work. For instance, let's say that I've got 10 lines of code, and the third line of code that I put in, I have to go and I have to make a call to a database. And that database is external, so I've got to go out to another URL. And I've got to go ask for a database, and I've got to ask it to return me a lot of records, etc. And that may take some time. So if I've got 10 lines of code and that's line 3, then lines 4 through 10 have to wait until that returns if I'm running in a synchronous method. All right, and as it says, there are times you just can't wait for a line of code to execute. So JavaScript solves this, and it solves this via the use of something called callbacks. And it actually does this in one of 3 ways, and all 3 are going to be discussed in the next few pages. The first page that's in there that's going to be discussed is what are called callbacks. The second will be called promises, and the third will be called async and await. All right, so let's look at this. I'm going to grab this line of code and I'm going to put this into a program, and hopefully it'll make a little sense to you. All right, but I'm going to put a bunch of alerts in here, and I'm going to put alert. This is alert number 1. All right, number 1. And let me put this down here. And then I'm going to put in a total of 5 of these. All right. And this will be alert number 2. This will be alert number 3. This will be alert number 4. And this will be alert number 5. And that'll print out what you think. It'll say this is alert 1, you close that. It'll say this is alert 2, you close that. It'll say this is alert 3, you close that. It'll say this is alert 4, you'll close that. It'll say this is alert 5. Totally fine, right? All right, but what if instead I do this? I'm going to grab this alert, the third one. It doesn't matter which one I grab, but I'm going to do it like this. And now I'm going to put in here, oops, this, and then I'm going to end up putting in here this, and this. All right. And I'm going to put them in here like this. In fact, let's put an empty line after each one. Now, when we had it the first way, as you saw, it would have printed out this is alert number 1, this is alert number 2, this is alert number 3, etc. Okay? But this right here, and I'm missing something because I have to give it an amount of time. So let's just, I'm brain farting. It's later at night, so I'm going to put JavaScript set timeout example. Okay. All right. So I'm going to just grab this one like that, and that's the one I'm going to put in here. All right. So this will be an alert, and again, this is alert number 3, and we're going to wait a whole 5 seconds. All right. So this will print out this is alert number 1. Then it'll print out this is alert number 2, exactly what you'd expect. But rather than printing this out, we're telling it to wait for 5 seconds. And since we used a set timeout in this example, it's going to go on and print this is alert number 4. Then it'll print this is alert number 5. And by that time, when the 5 seconds have expired, it'll print this is alert number 3. So by adding a set timeout in here, we have changed the order from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to 1, 2, 4, 5, 3. All right. Hopefully that makes at least a little bit of sense to you. So it says JavaScript solves this problem using callbacks. One of the simplest examples of how to use callbacks is timers. It's what I just showed you. Timers are not part of JavaScript. Rather, they're provided by the browser. All right. It says, let's talk about one of the things we have, set timeout. And I've given this example before, but I want to say this to you. I may or may not have given it in this set of videos. But I'm going to come in here and I'm going to put in analog alarm clock. I don't know if you remember these. You're probably too young, most of you, to ever have even seen one of these. But let's see, is there a one? I hate these 2 bell ones. I was hoping there'd be one with just 1 bell on it, but that's fine. All right, so let's just grab this one right here. Okay, so it is 10 to 2. I've set the alarm for 5 o'clock. All right, so this is a set timeout. I've told it once this goes around 3, 4, and it gets to 5, these are supposed to ring. Then when it's done, I turn that off. So a set timeout is a one-time thing, all right, that you want to have happen once when a certain condition is met. In the example we just went over, we want this to print after you wait for 5 seconds. This alert is a callback function. We're telling it to wait for 5 seconds and then run this. So what they're referring to, and that's usually the way it is, with a callback function, that's what this is. So in their case, it says the function containing that console log inside the function will be executed after 2 seconds. Our alert that says this is alert number 3, that will actually execute after 5 seconds. All right. So they show an example here. You've got the before, then the after, then the inside the function. So notice rather than printing before, inside the function, after, it prints before, it waits for 2 seconds. While it's waiting, it prints the after, then it comes back and it does the callback and it says inside the function. This is what's known as things being done asynchronously. So in other words, rather than the system having to synchronously run with 10 steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, if one or more of those steps within the 10 requires some time to happen, to execute, all right, you go in and you set it up asynchronously. So the author says, all of the things I mentioned are not core JavaScript, so they're not explained in this handbook, but you'll find lots of examples in my other handbooks. Well, we're going to look at this in more depth and breadth of coverage as we go on, okay? It says, here's how we can implement callbacks in our code. We define a function that accepts a callback parameter, which is a function. When this function is ready to invoke the callback, we invoke it passing the result. Now that's confusing. All right, and it says our code using this function would go something like this. The easier way to understand this is to just look at that first example. All right, the first one I showed you. All right, and I'm going to go into it because when I get done with this lecture, we are going to go in and with the next one from Mr. Copes, we're going to go into his JavaScript from ES5 and ES Next. And you'll notice in there that we have promises. And we will talk more about this in more depth and breadth of coverage than we have done so far in the one that we're going over. Okay? So if you'll bear with me until we finish that, we're almost done with this one. Now, over time, people decided that these regular callbacks were too difficult. Plus, these regular callbacks could lead to what was called callback hell. In fact, you can literally go out to, if you want to, you can go out to callbackhell.com and it'll show you an example of what can happen when you have continual callbacks. All right? So it was deemed by someone who's a lot smarter than me that this was too difficult. We shouldn't do this. So they came up with another way. It's kind of doing the same thing, but some of it's at least behind the scenes. And it's what are called promises. All right? And as it says, promises are an alternative way to deal with asynchronous code. As we saw previously with callbacks, we'd be passing a function to another function call that would be called when the function is finished processing. All right? So in other words, when the do something code ends, it calls the function received as a parameter. So it calls this when it's done. The main problem with this, as it says, is if we need to use the result inside of our code, you've got to keep nesting and nesting and nesting, and that's what leads to that callback hell. So one way of getting around this, and we'll talk about two of them right now, but the first way of getting around this is to use what are called promises. All right? So rather than coding this, you code this. And you look at it and you go, well, there's not that much difference. All right? It says, but we call the function, we have a then method that is called when the function ends. Now, promises are, there's three things, three states of a promise. All right? And basically, a promise can be accepted, it can be rejected, or it can be kind of in purgatory mode. If it's accepted, that means that everything worked. If it's rejected, it didn't all work. And if it's not yet called, it's kind of in that purgatory mode. All right? So it says, also, when you do this, what if something goes wrong? If something goes wrong in here, if this doesn't work, then you put a catch statement in there, which will catch the error from your promise. All right? So it says instead of declaring a normal function like this, you declare it like this as a new promise. Now, this is pretty heavy stuff. We're not going to go much into this in our AWD 1000 class, but we will in the AWD 1111 class. All right? So what I call the promise is kept, it's known as resolving a promise. That means it was successful and the then runs. If the promise doesn't work, then it's rejected. Then rather than what runs. So this is what happens if the promise is accepted and everything is cool. This is what happens if the promise is rejected. All right, so it's something happened and it didn't work. All right, now, over time, people decided that that was too difficult. So we had callbacks, which led to callback hell, and there's still a lot of code out there that use callbacks. Then we had promises, and some people still thought that promises were a little bit too difficult. So what they did was they figured out another way to do some of the promises stuff kind of in the background, all right? And that is by using what is called async and await. So as it says, async functions are a higher level of abstraction over promises, meaning more is happening behind the scenes. An async function returns a promise. And there's an example in it right here. All right. Now, when you work with this, you've got to use some of the verbiage in here. You've got to use the async and the word await. All right. Any code that you want to use this function will have to use the async, which means you're telling it, all right, to run asynchronously. And by doing so, any data is going to be in there under the data variable. Now, there'll be an example, I'm sure. So there's the async. So we're saying run this asynchronously and use the await. Now, what they mention here is the async await duo allows us to have cleaner code and a simple mental model to work on this. Now, not for the people in the AWD 1000 class, but more for the people in the AWD 1111 class, the class you take third semester. I struggle with this stuff, all right? And, whoops. So I tried to figure out a way that I could understand it better. And I went out to Amazon, and I found a book. I have the book that's called JavaScript Async Events, Callbacks, Callbacks, Promises, and Async Await. All right. And they're not showing it in here, but I have the book. Actually, I may have bought the book from Barnes & Noble. So let's see. All right, sorry about that. Let the clock get going. So put in this, hit enter, and that's my book. I've got it right in front of me, but you can't see it. Looks just like this. And if I look at it, and I look at, let's see. I don't know if it'll give me this or not, but I'm going to try. Well, it says it's under Amazon. It just didn't find it. There it is, under Amazon. When I click on here, all right, what I'm trying to show you is here is the table of contents. So, modern JavaScript and async, events, standard and customs, callbacks, async, worker threads, promises, producing promises, the dispatch queue, async and await, and cache and the service worker. There's about 160 pages in here. I'm in the middle of reading it right now, but then I'm going to prepare another bunch of lectures and a bunch of videos based on this book. I won't do it today, but I'll start on it soon. All right, let's finish this up. So the idea is you can string together a bunch of these then statements. All right, it's going to result in cleaner code. May not look like it, but it does result in cleaner code. Finally, the last thing that's mentioned in here, we're up to page 67 of 70, is variable scope. And the author, at the beginning, he talked about const and let and var. We said don't use var. All right, use const and use let. All right, it says there is a very important difference between var, let, and const. A variable defined as var inside a function is only visible inside of that function. A variable defined as const or let is only visible inside the block. So it's in the curly braces in which it's been defined. All right. So they give some examples in here, and the bottom line is this. It used to be that if when you const typically was always done at the top of the program because it made a constant, and because it's declared outside of any function or method, it becomes global to the program, so you can use it without having to pass it. Same thing with let. All right, and if you know that, Just forget var ever existed, and you'll be pretty well off. All right, I took what they just put in here, and I simplified it. So we've now done 3 of these. No, I don't want to save any changes. So when I come back again, I'm going to be going into this one, which is JavaScript from ES5 to ES Next. All right, that'll be 4th in my series, and it'll be coming shortly.